Today we're going to embark on a journey that will take us deeper into the corridors of human history than we have ever dared to go before. We are setting the clock back not just by centuries, but by millennia, travelling to a time that exists on the very edge of recorded memory, a time where history and legend blur into a single terrifying reality. We are going to speak of the era of the giants. We are going to recount the rise and fall of the first two great superpowers that emerged from the mud and silt of the earth following the great flood of Noah. These are the chronicles of the people of Ad and the people of Thamud. These were not merely tribes huddled in tents fighting for survival against the elements. They were empires. They were civilizations that reached the absolute zenith of architectural might, biological dominance, and material wealth. They built what no human hand had ever built before, and what no human hand has ever been able to replicate since. They felt they were the masters of the earth, invincible and eternal, yet they were erased from the face of existence in a mere matter of days, leaving behind nothing but whispers carried by the desert winds and enigmatic tombs carved into silent mountains. To truly understand the weight and the magnitude of this story, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of the world as it existed immediately after the flood. The waters of the Great Deluge had receded, draining away into the deep crevices of the earth, leaving behind a planet that had been washed clean. The silence must have been profound. The noise of the old world, the corruption, the violence, the noise of armies and markets had all been silenced by the water. The Ark of Noah, peace be upon him, had come to rest upon the rugged, jutting peaks of Mount Judy. Noah descended from the ship, leading a small band of believers. These were the remnant of humanity, the handful of souls who had held on to their faith when the rest of the world drowned in mockery and water. They stepped onto a pristine earth, a planet rebooted. There was no sin in this new world, there was no bloodshed, no corruption, no greed, and most significantly, there was no idolatry. The air was pure, filled with the scent of wet earth and renewal, and the worship was pure. The survivors fell to their knees on the damp soil, their foreheads touching the ground in submission to the one God, the Creator, associating no partners with Him. They were upon the natural state of monotheism, united by survival and gratitude, understanding that they owed every breath to the mercy of the divine. From the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the roots of all future nations began to take hold in the soil of this new earth. They spread out across the vast empty continents, repopulating the silent valleys and the unoccupied plains. From the lineage of Shem came the Arabs and the Semitic peoples, destined to be the carriers of the prophetic torch. From Ham came the mighty nations of Africa. From Japheth came the peoples of the north and Europe. As the years stretched into decades and decades melted into centuries, the population grew. Villages became towns and towns became cities. The terrifying visceral memory of the flood, which was once a trauma that kept men awake at night, began to fade. It slowly transformed from a lived reality into a story told by grandfathers around the fire to wide-eyed children. Then, as those children grew old, it softened into a legend. Finally, for many it calcified into a myth. And in this creeping amnesia, the fatal flaw of humanity revealed itself. We forget. We forget the pain when the wound heals. We forget the warning when the danger passes. We forget the source of our salvation when we feel secure. It was in this vacuum of memory, in this space between gratitude and arrogance, that the devil, the eternal enemy of mankind, began his work anew. He did not come to them with fire and terror. He did not appear as a monster. He came with a whisper, a subtle suggestion wrapped in the guise of love, piety, and respect. He observed that the people deeply loved the righteous men among them. When a scholar or a pious elder died, the community was struck with grief. The devil whispered to them, suggesting that they carve statues of these righteous men, not to worship them, but simply to remember them, to look upon their faces and be inspired to pray with the same fervour and dedication. It seemed like a beautiful, innocent, and even noble idea. So they carved the stone. For a generation these statues were merely memorials, silent tributes to human goodness. But then the fathers died, and the sons took their place. The context was lost. The original intention faded. The devil whispered a new lie to the sons. He told them that their fathers did not just look at these statues for inspiration, but that they venerated them. He claimed that these statues were intermediaries, conduits that carried prayers to the heavens, and that without them, God was too distant to reach. Slowly, imperceptibly, the reverence turned into ritual. The ritual turned into worship. The memorial became a god. And thus the darkness of idolatry returned to the earth, not with a sudden explosion, but with the quiet, creeping steps of a thief in the night. The first major civilization to rise and shatter the covenant of monotheism in this new world was the nation of Ad. They were a people destined to become a warning for all time. They were Arabs, specifically the original, pure Arabs known as the Arab Araba, who inhabited the peninsula long before the tribes of Jurhum or the descendants of Ishmael appeared. Their lineage was noble and direct, tracing back to Ad, the son of Uz, the son of Iram, the son of Shem, the son of Noah. They were the direct great-grandchildren of the survivors, separated from the flood by only a few generations. They settled in a region known as Al-Akaf. To envision their home, one must wipe away the image of the modern desert that we see on maps today. Al-Akaf, located in the southern Arabian Peninsula between Yemen, Oman and Hadramaut, is today known as the Empty Quarter, a desolate ocean of shifting sand where life struggles to exist. But in the time of Ad, climate science and historical records tell us that the Arabian Peninsula was a green Arabia. It was a paradise of lush savannas, thundering rivers and dense forests. Imagine a landscape where fresh, cool water flowed freely through emerald valleys, where towering palm trees swayed in the gentle breeze, laden with heavy clusters of dates, and where vast gardens of grapes and grain stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a land of aggressive abundance, a garden planted by the divine in the heart of the earth to test its inhabitants with prosperity. But the most striking, terrifying feature of the people of Ad was not their land, but their own bodies. They were giants. The Quran is explicit and literal about this, stating that God increased them in creation extensively. They were not merely tall men, they were biological titans. A man of Ad was a fortress of flesh and bone. His height reached several meters, dwarfing the humans of later generations. His bone density was like iron, his muscle mass supernatural. He could walk into a mountain range, identify a boulder the size of a small house, tear it from the earth with a single hand and cast it aside as if it were nothing more than a pebble. They possessed a physical vitality that made them immune to the weariness that plagues normal men. They could march for days without fatigue. They could build without machinery. They were the apex predators of the human race, and they knew it. They walked the earth with a swagger that shook the ground, confident that nothing in creation could challenge them. They did not live in simple dwellings or caves. They built a civilization that mirrored their colossal stature. They constructed Iram of the Pillars, a city that became the stuff of legend and mystery. The pillars mentioned in the ancient text were not ordinary columns. They were forest-like structures of stone, each one thicker than a giant redwood tree carved from single blocks of marble and granite, towering hundreds of feet into the sky to support palaces that defied gravity. These pillars were polished until they shone like mirrors, decorated with gold and precious stones that caught the light of the sun. They built on every high place, erecting towers and fortresses on the peaks of mountains, not because they feared any enemy for who would dare attack a nation of giants, but simply to satisfy their vanity. They wanted travellers from miles away to look up at the skyline and tremble at the sight of their architecture. They mastered the art of hydrology, building massive cisterns and reservoirs called masani to capture the rainwater, ensuring that even in the driest season their cups were full and their gardens remained green. They lived with the delusion that they would remain in this state forever, that death and decay were for lesser beings, and that they had conquered the laws of nature. The combination of unlimited strength, untold wealth, and a life of extreme luxury created a cocktail of arrogance that poisoned their souls. They looked at their hands and saw their own power, forgetting the God who gave it to them. They looked at their city and saw their own genius, forgetting the inspiration of the Creator. They began to utter the phrase that would seal their fate, asking the heavens with a sneer, asking who is mightier than us in strength. It was a rhetorical challenge to the divine. They became tyrants on the earth. They used their strength not to protect the weak, but to crush them. They would raid neighbouring tribes for sport, enslaving men and seizing resources they did not need. If they struck a man, they did not just hurt him, they destroyed him. They were merciless, compulsive oppressors who delighted in their dominance, and to crown their rebellion, They carved idols. They took the stone they had mastered and shaped it into gods named Sad, Samud, and Hara. They placed these lifeless rocks in their glittering temples and bowed their massive heads to the floor, thanking the stone for the rain, thanking the stone for the strength, thanking the stone for the children. It was the ultimate betrayal of logic for a giant to bow to a pebble. Yet, God is Al-Halim, the forbearing. He does not strike immediately, he gives time, he sends warnings, and most importantly, he sends messengers. To these giants he sent a man from their own blood, a brother they knew and trusted. This was the prophet Hud, peace be upon him. Hud was not a stranger, he was royalty among them. His lineage was pure, his face familiar. He was a giant like them, strong, noble, and strikingly handsome, with a thick beard and a face that radiated calm. He had a reputation for unshakable honesty and wisdom. God chose him because a messenger must be relatable. If an angel had descended with wings of light, Ad would have dismissed him, saying he did not understand the struggles of flesh and blood. So God sent a man who ate their food, walked their markets, and spoke their dialect. Hud began his mission in the public squares of Iram. He stood tall and delivered the message that has echoed through the ages. He called out to his people, telling them to worship God, reminding them that they had no deity other than him. He asked them if they would not fear the consequences of their actions. His message was simple, yet it threatened to topple the entire social hierarchy of Ad. He did not ask for their gold, he did not ask for a crown, he asked them to use their intellect. He pointed to the idols and asked if these stones created them, or if they had carved them with their own chisels just yesterday. He asked why they humiliated themselves before their own creations. He tried to soften their hardened hearts by reminding them of God's grace. He asked them to remember when God made them successors after the people of Noah. He asked them to recall the catastrophe that befell those before them and not to think they were immune. He reminded them that God increased them in stature and that the body they were so proud of was a loan, not a possession. He spoke to them with the tenderness of a brother terrified for his siblings, telling them that he feared for them the punishment of a great day. But the elite of Ad, the Mala, were not interested in truth. They were addicted to power. Hud's message of equality before one God meant that the strong had no divine right to oppress the weak, and this was unacceptable to them. They launched a vicious campaign of character assassination. They sneered at him, calling him a fool. They accused him of being a liar. They dismissed him as a mere human who ate and drank like them, asking why they should follow a man with no supernatural halo. They laughed and claimed that their idols had possessed him with madness, that he was mentally unstable because he dared to insult their stone gods. Hud stood against this tidal wave of mockery like a mountain. He did not lose his temper. He did not return insult for insult. He replied with a dignified, heartbreaking calm, assuring them there was no foolishness in him, but that he was a messenger from the Lord of the worlds. He challenged their logic, asking if it was so strange that God would send a reminder through a man from amongst them to warn them. For years this spiritual battle raged. It was not a brief encounter, it was a grueling marathon of patience. Hud went to their festivals, their assemblies, their homes. He was relentless in his love, and they were relentless in their hatred. Only a small handful of people believed him, mostly the poor, the weak, the ones who felt the boot of Ad's tyranny on their necks. They saw in Hud a liberator and a voice of truth, but they were few, and they lived in fear. Finally, the arrogance of Ad reached its boiling point. They grew tired of the warnings. They looked Hud in the eye and issued the challenge that would end their history. They asked if he had come to them so that they should worship God alone and abandon what their fathers worshipped. They demanded that he bring the punishment he promised, if he was indeed truthful. They taunted the Almighty. Hud realized the door of mercy had been slammed shut by their own hands. He looked at them with profound sorrow and told them that restriction and wrath had already befallen them from their Lord. He told them to wait, and that he would be with them among those who wait. The first stage of the end was silence. The rain, which had been the source of their lush paradise, simply stopped. The clouds that used to dance over the valleys of Al-Akaf evaporated. The sun began to beat down with a new, cruel intensity. The emerald green of the land turned to a sickly yellow. The thundering rivers thinned into trickles, then into mud, and finally into dust. For 3 years, a crushing drought gripped the land of giants. This was the warning shot. God was squeezing them, stripping away their luxury to see if they would humble themselves. The heat was oppressive. Their throats were dry. Their livestock began to die. Hud pleaded with them one last time, begging them to ask forgiveness of their Lord and repent to him, promising that God would send the sky upon them in showers and increase them in strength, added to their strength. He offered them a way out that included regaining their worldly power. But pride is a form of blindness. Instead of repenting, they became more stubborn. They sent a delegation to the holy sanctuary to pray for rain, but they prayed to their idols, refusing to acknowledge the Creator. Then, one fateful morning, the horizon darkened. The people of Ad rushed out of their palaces, their eyes scanning the distance. They saw a massive, dense formation rolling towards them across the sky. It looked heavy, black, and brooding. A cheer went up from the city. They shouted to one another that this was a cloud, bringing them rain. They danced in the streets, preparing their cisterns, mocking Hud, believing their gods had finally answered. Hud stood apart, watching the approaching darkness with dread. He saw what they did not. He felt the unnatural drop in pressure. He saw the colour of the cloud was not the grey of rain, but the black of doom. He whispered that it was not rain, but what they sought to hasten, a wind containing a painful punishment. The cloud was not water, it was the Sarsa wind. It hit them with the force of a solid wall. This was not a storm, it was a meteorological singularity. The wind was unnaturally freezing cold, a biting frost that shattered stone and froze blood in the veins, and it screamed. The sound was like 1,000 thunders, a high-pitched, shrieking roar that burst eardrums and terrified the soul. The giants of Ad, who had bragged that nothing on earth could move them, were tossed into the air like dry leaves. The wind possessed a terrifying intelligence. It would snatch a man up, a man 6 meters tall, lift him hundreds of feet into the churning grey void and hold him there. He would flail, screaming, suspended in the sky, helpless against the power of God. Then, the wind would slam him headfirst into the earth. The impact was so violent it would sever his head, leaving his massive body lying on the ground like a hollow, uprooted palm trunk. For 7 nights and 8 days the storm raged. It was unrelenting. It did not pause to let them breathe. It did not let them sleep. It hunted them. Ad tried to run. They fled into their stone palaces, locking the massive iron doors, but the wind tore the doors off their hinges and pursued them down the marble corridors. They ran into their mountain caves, but the wind snaked inside and pulled them out. It destroyed everything. The pillars of Iram toppled and shattered. The gardens were ripped from the earth. The livestock was blown into the sea. The civilization was shredded into oblivion. But amidst this apocalypse, there was a circle of peace. Hud had gathered the believers in a small enclosure. Within that circle, the wind was nothing more than a gentle, cool breeze that refreshed their faces. A few meters away, the world was ending. But for the believers, there was calm. They sat in the eye of the storm, protected by their faith. On the 8th day, the howling stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the wind. Hud and the survivors stepped out to a scene of total devastation. The nation of Ad lay dead. Their bodies covered the ground, twisted and broken. The great city was a ruin, soon to be buried under the sands of the empty quarter. Hud turned his back on the graveyard of giants and led his people away, leaving the ruins as a silent lesson for the generations to come. Centuries passed. The sands covered the bones of Ad. The story became a legend again. And then, a new tribe rose to power in the north. These were the people of Thamud. They were cousins to Ad, also Arabs, settling in the region of Al-Hijr, a rocky tract between Medina and Tabuk. One would think that humanity would have learned. One would think that walking past the scattered ruins of Ad would keep any nation humble. Thamud knew the story well. They recited it in their poetry, but they drew the wrong conclusion. They analysed Ad's fall with arrogance. They said that Ad was foolish because they built pillars on the sand, and that is why the wind destroyed them. They claimed they were smarter and would not build on the open ground. They decided to carve the mountains. They believed that their technology and engineering would save them where Ad's brute strength had failed. Thamud were master architects of stone. They possessed iron tools and a deep, sophisticated understanding of geology. They would select a massive sandstone mountain, study its grain and density, and then slice into it with precision. They carved intricate facades that resembled grand temples, with columns, friezes, and triangular pediments. They hollowed out the mountains to create palaces that were cool in the summer, warm in the winter, and structurally indestructible. They also built villas on the plains for the spring season. They were wealthy, artistic, and highly civilized. They had a complex social structure, with the elite hoarding the fertile lands and water sources while the poor struggled. And inevitably, they worshipped idols. They fell into the same ancient trap, combining arrogance, wealth, and forgetfulness to birth idolatry once more. To this nation of stone carvers, God sent Saleh, peace be upon him. Saleh was a man of high standing among them. He was intelligent, noble, and universally respected. The people of Thamud viewed him as their future leader, a man of promise. But the moment he stood up and called them to worship God alone, their admiration turned to disgust. They lamented that he had been a man of promise among them before this. They felt betrayed. They wanted a king to lead them to glory, not a prophet to lead them to piety. Saleh argued with them patiently. He reminded them of Ad, asking them to remember when God made them successors after Ad. He warned them not to repeat their mistakes, but the elite of Thamud were cynical and demanding. They did not want a sermon. They wanted a spectacle. They decided to trap Saleh with a request they believed was impossible. The leaders gathered in the public square, in the shadow of their carved mountains. They pointed to a solitary, jagged, massive rock that stood apart from the cliffs. They sneered at Saleh, telling him that if he was truly a messenger of God, he must make a camel come out of that solid rock. And they added impossible conditions, laughing as they listed them. It must be a she-camel. She must be huge. She must be 10 months pregnant. She must be hairy and beautiful. They were asking for biology to emerge from geology, for life to spring from dead matter. It was a logical impossibility. Saleh looked at them and asked if they would believe if he brought them what they asked. They swore a solemn oath that they would. Saleh stood before the rock. He raised his hands to the sky. He prayed with the desperation of a prophet who yearns to save his people. The earth began to rumble. The rock groaned as if in labour. The laughter of the crowd died in their throats. Cracks appeared on the surface of the stone, glowing with heat. Then, with a sound like tearing thunder, the rock split open. And from the cold, hard, inanimate stone, a living, breathing, colossal she-camel stepped out. She shook the dust from her fur. She let out a loud, resonant bellow that echoed through the valley. She was exactly as they had described, pregnant, huge, and undeniably real. The crowd stood paralyzed. They were witnessing a glitch in reality, a manifest miracle. Saleh declared that this was the she-camel of God. He used the possessive form to emphasize her sanctity. He gave them a strict command, telling them she was a sign for them, and ordered them to let her eat in God's land and not to touch her with harm, lest they be seized by an impending punishment. God established a trial for them involving their water. The water in their main well was limited. Saleh announced the divine rule. One day, the water was for the camel, she would drink it all. The next day, the water was for the people and their livestock. It was a test of sharing and obedience. On the camel's day, she would drink the well dry, but miraculously she would provide enough milk to feed the entire city. Thousands of people would milk her, filling every pot, jar and skin. It was a fair trade, water for milk. For a while, they lived with this miracle. The camel walked among them, grazing freely. She gave birth to her calf, a replica of herself. But miracles do not cure a diseased heart. The elite hated her. Why? Because she was a walking, breathing proof that Saleh was right, and they were wrong. Every time they saw her massive silhouette against the sunset, they felt their authority crumbling. She frightened their cattle. She drank their water. She was a constant, irritating reminder of a God they refused to submit to. Hatred brewed in the dark corners of the city. In the city of Thamud, there was a gang of 9 men, described in the scriptures as the group who spread corruption in the land and did not reform. They were the mafia of Thamud, led by 2 wretched individuals, Qidar bin Salif and Muzda bin Mahraj. Qidar was a man of terrifying appearance, with a red face, blue eyes, and a heart blacker than coal. He was violent, an alcoholic, and deeply arrogant. But the spark for the ultimate crime came from women. 2 women of the elite, angry at the camel for consuming their livestock's water, approached Qidar and Musta. They offered their immense wealth and their beauty as a reward if the men would kill the beast. lust and arrogance combined to seal the fate of the nation. The 9 men met in a secret, alcohol-fueled gathering. They swore a blood oath. They planned to kill the camel and then kill Saleh and his family. They plotted to lie when Saleh's clan came for revenge, claiming they were nowhere near the scene. It was a perfectly planned coup against the divine. The next morning, as the She-Camel came down the narrow gorge to drink, the assassins lay in wait behind the rocks. Musta drew his bow and shot an arrow. It struck the camel in the leg. She stumbled, roaring in pain and confusion. She tried to turn back, but Kedar, sword in hand, leaped out from his hiding place. With a savage yell, Kedar struck her hamstrings, the tendons behind the knees. The massive mountain of a beast crashed to the ground, helpless. The earth shook with her fall. Kedar then finished the gruesome deed, slaughtering the miracle of God in cold blood. The camel's calf, seeing its mother murdered, ran up the mountain. It stood on the peak, looked at the sky, and let out 3 high-pitched, heartbreaking cries. Then it vanished into the rock from which it came. The deed was done. The killers returned to the city, heroes to the elite, villains to the truth. They mocked Saleh, shouting that they had killed his camel and challenging him to bring the punishment if he was truly a messenger. Saleh looked at the carcass of the sign of God. He looked at the blood soaking the sand. He turned to his people, tears streaming down his face, and delivered the final verdict. He told them to enjoy themselves in their homes for 3 days, declaring that this was a promise that would not be denied. 3 days. That was the countdown. On the first morning, Thursday, the people of Thamud woke up and looked at each other in horror. Their faces had turned a sickly, sulphurous yellow. The bravado of the previous day evaporated. They knew Saleh was telling the truth. The fear began to gnaw at their stomachs. On the second morning, Friday, the yellow turned to a deep, burning red. It was as if their blood was boiling beneath their skin. They were frantic, weeping, digging their own graves in their houses, waiting for the end. On the third morning, Saturday, their faces turned pitch black. Total despair settled over the city. They sat in their majestic carved palaces, huddled together, trembling. They kept looking at the sky, looking at the ground, wondering how the death would come. Would it be wind like Ad? Would it be fire? Would it be a flood? Sunday morning dawned. The sun rose over the silent city. The birds stopped singing. The air stood still. Then it came. It was not a wind. It was the blast. It was a sound generated from the heavens, a sonic boom of cosmic proportions, accompanied by a violent tremor from the earth beneath them. The sound was so intense, so sharp and so powerful that it did not just break eardrums, it stopped hearts, it ruptured internal organs, it shredded the nervous system. It was a sound that carried the wrath of God. In a fraction of a second, every disbeliever in Thamud fell dead. They were found lying prostrate on their faces, knees tucked under them, as if they had been frozen in the moment of cowering. The king on his throne died. The conspirators in their meeting died. The rich man counting his gold died. The sculptor carving the rock died. Silence returned to Al-Hijr. The mighty palaces carved into the mountains remained perfectly intact. The intricate designs were untouched. But the city was a tomb. Saleh and the believers, whom God had guided out of the city before the blast, returned to see the aftermath. Saleh stood over the bodies of his people. He spoke to the dead, a final eulogy of sorrow. He told them that he had conveyed the message of his Lord and advised them, but they did not like advisers, and so Ad and Thamud vanished. Ad was buried by the wind and sand. Thamud was silenced by the sound and the rock. Centuries later, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed by Madain Saleh on his way to the expedition of Tabuk. He saw the carved homes still standing, ghostly and empty. His companions marvelled at the beauty of the architecture. Some went to drink from the well of the camel. The Prophet stopped them immediately. He covered his head with his cloak and urged his camel to move faster. He warned them not to enter upon those who were punished unless they were weeping. He told them if they were not weeping, then do not enter upon them, lest there befall them the like of what befell the people of Thamud. He taught us that these ruins are not tourist attractions for amusement. They are graveyards of arrogance. They are reminders that no matter how strong your walls, no matter how tall your towers, no matter how much gold you bury in your vaults, if you stand against the truth, if you oppress the weak, If you ignore the Creator, you're nothing more than dust waiting for the wind. The giants are gone. Their bones are dust. But their story remains, echoing across the centuries, asking us a single, terrifying question about our own arrogance and our own fate. If this journey into the past captivated you, please subscribe and share this story with others. History is the school of the wise. Let me know in the comments which part of the story shook you the most. Until next time, peace be upon you.